This is another one of our exciting collaborative programs in which we have six different congregations from 5 different states participating. We have Houston Congregation for Reform Judaism in Houston, Texas, Columbia Jewish Congregation, Columbia, Maryland, Congregation Torah El in Oakhurst, New Jersey, East Brunswick Jewish Center in East Brunswick, New Jersey, Ezra Habanim, the Niles Township Congregation in Skokie, Illinois, and Temple Israel of Albany, of course, Albany, New York. So welcome to everyone. My name is Justin Deutsch, and I'm the program director at Houston Congregation for Reform Judaism. All the partners here, we hope you enjoy watching the documentary Joseph Pulitzer, Voice of the People, and are excited for our Q&A with Pulitzer filmmaker Oren Rudavsky, who is here with us. And so before we start, this has been a kind of very long process to get to this point. I don't know if you all know this, but Oren and I started talking back in July about this idea. And so we started in July, and then we finally booked a date in January, when we found a date that worked for everyone. And now I didn't know this at the time, but this week and today specifically is a great day to discuss a film because it's the Oscars, right? And so the Oscars are an event that you celebrate the best in film, the best director, the best costume designer, the best actor, all that good stuff. It's on in 5 hours on ABC, and today we get to kind of celebrate Joseph Pulitzer, Voice of the People, talk about the film, celebrate its accomplishments, learn more about it, which I think is pretty neat. So it's a nice little tie-in right there. And although Joseph Pulitzer, Voice of the People did not win an Oscar in its award year of 2019, it did receive a nominee for a Writers Guild of America nomination for Best Documentary Screenplay. So it did get a recognition there. Before I introduce Oren, a few things. So today's program is pretty much all Q&A. So if you have a question, actually, I already see 3 here. So if you have a question, that's great. Put them in the chat. No need to wait to the end of the program. You can put them in. I certainly have some questions as well, but we'll weave them in to get your questions answered. You can put them in the chat. If you want to see Oren and I as far as the largest you can, I recommend going to the speaker view. And with that, here's some information about Oren. So Oren Rudavsky is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and several National Endowment for the Humanities and National Endowment for the Arts grants. He's produced a number of films, including Witness Theater, which is a film chronicling a self-help organized workshop between Holocaust survivors and high school students. His films Colliding Dreams, which was co-directed with Joseph Dorman, and The Ruins of Lifta, which was co-directed with Menachem Dam, were released theatrically in 2016. And Colliding Dreams was broadcast on PBS in May 2018. And of course, his most recent film is Joseph Pulitzer, Voice of the People. And after 9 long months, Oren, thanks for joining us on Zoom today.
My pleasure. I just have to add the things that people see on my resume that they know. I actually worked on the inaugural season of The Real World, the 25th anniversary season of Saturday Night Live, a program you might have heard of, and a series called Tales from the Dark Side back in the day. But the other films I'm very proud of are A Life Apart, about the Hasidic community, which is getting close to its 25th anniversary, and a film called Hiding and Seeking. So that's to round that out. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, no problem. Hold on one sec. I'm just sending someone the link. So yeah, let's start. So obviously, right. So before you have a film, right, the idea has to come from somewhere. Where did the idea of doing a Joseph Pulitzer film come from?
Well, I have to credit my Robert Seidman, who's my co-writer and co-producer, and actually Bob co-wrote the screenplay, the script for the documentary about the Hasidim, A Life Apart, way back in the day, and it took us another 25 years to really. We've made many films between us in that time, but Bob Seidman is a novelist, and he'd been trying to write a novel about Joseph Pulitzer, and he writes these novels that are semi-fictional, but he asked me to if I was interested in making a film about Joseph Pulitzer, and frankly, all I knew about Joseph Pulitzer, and many of you who haven't seen this film perhaps knew, was about the Pulitzer Prizes. That's about all I knew, and I knew that a few other things about him. But then a film, you have to get excited about a film. You don't want to just make a film because it hasn't been done before. And there was a memoir that his secretary, who traveled with him the last year of his life, which Pulitzer spent primarily on his yacht, which was over 100 and over 300, sorry, 300 feet long. The only yacht that was longer than that was J.P. Morgan's yacht. It beat it by like 7 feet. But Pulitzer couldn't stand still, couldn't sit still, and so he had a number of secretaries and crew who traveled with him on his yacht. And this one, Aline Ireland, wrote a book called Adventures with a Genius. And it was, a lot of the stuff written about Pulitzer is kind of hagiographic, and you can't really get it. And his proclamations, he was a brilliant man, but a lot of his proclamations read from that era really over the top. They're bombastic, they're big statements. Some of them are great, but I couldn't get a feel for who this guy was. But this book, Adventures with a Genius, really gave me a lens into the peculiarities of this very peculiar, very odd, very eccentric, and as I said, brilliant man, ambitious to the nth degree, and an immigrant. And so that's what captivated me about the film, and that's just the beginning of the process. This already goes back for 8 years, and then we had to, figure out how to make the film, figure out how to get it funded.
Let's go back to you mentioned the yacht, and I thought that was an interesting part of the film because we do see, I guess, a yacht which perhaps somewhat looked like Pulitzer's yacht, the Liberty. We see it in the beginning and at the end in Bar Harbor and Charleston, South Carolina. How did you find a yacht for that kind of recreation of in which you kind of show his health failing in the last couple of years of his life?
Yeah, well, that was an adventure in and of itself, and quite frankly, we didn't even imagine filming on a yacht at the beginning. First, we had to get funding, and this long process of getting funding, most of which came from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which involves writing scripts and the rest of it, and then PBS series American Masters signed on. But even then, these kinds of historical documentaries, which are archivally based, are very expensive to make. There's a lot of research that goes into them, but at a certain point, it became clear. The film evolved because. So I'm giving you a little more backstory, but it evolved because this film started before there was a Trump presidency, and before there was even an idea that there would be one, and before the issues of freedom of the press and freedom of speech were so much a part of the daily dialogue, and before all the feelings about what immigration should be, and before all the issues about immigrants, the film, we were working on the film, and as time went by, some issues that might not have been so significant to the film grew in importance. And one of those was the case that became a Supreme Court case when President Teddy Roosevelt challenged Pulitzer, who was investigating the funding of the Panama Canal, which was one of Roosevelt's greatest achievements in his mind, but there was some question about the funding of the canal and where the money came from, and where the money, more significantly, where it went. And it had started out as a French project. It became an American project. And so at a certain point in the making of the film, we said, well, how are we going to bring to life Pulitzer's life on this boat, and how are we going to bring to life this freedom of speech story, which happened, this Supreme Court case, which happened in the last few years of his life. And 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 I'm one who is mixed about recreations, and sometimes they work brilliantly, sometimes they work less brilliantly. And what this there was an evolution to this, to the boat, and very briefly I'll tell what the evolution was, which is I had an assistant in my office, and I was combing through all these photographs of Joseph Pulitzer, and I had a photograph in my hand of Joseph Pulitzer or on my computer. In my hand doesn't exist anymore. On my computer, um, and I was looking at this photo, and I gazed up, and there was my assistant with the same sort of scruffy beard that Pulitzer had, and similar glasses. And in profile, he looked shockingly like Pulitzer at the age of, in his early 20s, when he, or not even his early 20s, after he first arrived in America. And I thought, wow, this is just too much of a coincidence to pass up. Let's try to shoot some recreations with my assistant. It's just too easy. And we filmed these initial scenes where Pulitzer's eyesight is going, and that's a big theme of the film, his blindness. So we filmed some scenes, and I said, I actually like the way these came out, and we got the equipment that ophthalmologists would use in that early day, when if you got a detached retina, they could do nothing. And this is the 1880s. One of the questions, Pulitzer came to America as a soldier in the Civil War. So in 1860, towards the end of the war, in 1864, I believe. I might have my dates. It's been a few years, but and that's how he actually got his citizenship. Because if you came over as an immigrant, and you fought in the war, and what we gave people who wanted it citizenships. It wasn't that difficult back in the day. Anyway, so to the boat. Um, I'm skipping a lot of time, but because he built the boat towards the end of his life, he loved sailing, and he would take these massive steamships where he was a passenger, but he didn't like being a passenger. He would buy out. He was so wealthy, he could buy out all the staterooms around him, so there wouldn't be any excess noise. But that didn't satisfy him enough. He wanted his own boat, and he could afford to build his own boat. But finding a boat in 2017 was not as easy as to find a 300-foot boat. His boat was used as a ship, as a hospital ship, and then it was scrapped, I think, by sometime in World War II. And if I'm getting that date wrong, I apologize. But there's only there's very few boats that were built in the early 1900s that still exist. And one of them was a boat called the Cangarda, which was a boat that was stationed off of the coast of Maine. And the gentleman who owned it gave us permission to use the boat free, whereas the other boats, there was one in California, they wanted $10,000 a day, and there was one in England. Those were our choices, and they wanted even more than that. And somehow, miraculously, this man gave us permission to use his boat, which we did. Still, it was an extremely expensive shoot, because we had to bring our whole crew, camera people, actors, all the costume people, and trying to do accurate costumes and accurate recreating the newspapers, which fell apart in your hands if you tried to use the original ones. all these um, he had a boat that was furnished to that era of the 1910s, and we could use it all. And it was still an incredibly nerve-wracking shoot because we had 2 days. That's all we could afford, and we had to ferry everybody up and hope that the weather would cooperate. And the weather not only cooperated, but in the in the course of those 2 days, we had fog, we had sun, we had rain, we had waves, we had, it just worked out. Sometimes you feel like it is in God's hands, and that's the story of the boat. We got the boat, we got the shoot, and it became an integral part of our story.
I read today that actually, is it true that you thought you lost some of the actors? They went in a rowboat, and there's some
Well,
great everyone.
yeah,
There's some great interviews online, but yeah, can you talk about a little bit?
yeah. Well, my co-writer Bob Seidman is pushing 80, and he played the part of a butler in costume, um, but he was in charge of rowing the doctor, played by my producer Andrea Miller's husband, who was an amateur actor, and off they Bob's job was to row him close to the ship so we could film him, but there was a current, and Bob is a strong little guy, but at age 78, he started drifting off into the fog and literally disappeared. And neither of them had there was no cell phone service anyway out there. So we, luckily we had a motorboat that, that, that made circles and eventually towed him back to our boat. So, so there were adventures like that. You never know what's going to happen when you make a film, and that was one of the stomach churning moments out there, because also in the fog you're worried that a boat's going to go by and ram into them, and when you lose your crew, it's hard to keep filming. It's in bad form to say, well, we lost two of them, but we're going to keep filming because we got to get this film done. So luckily that didn't happen.
All right, let's jump to a couple questions in the chat. We do have a couple questions about Pulitzer's Judaism, which is, I guess, not the focus of the film, but obviously he was a Hungarian Jew. So the first one comes in from Fran, and she's asking, were his children raised Jewish? Were Pulitzer's children raised Jewish?
Well, Pulitzer did, he did have he was the yeshiva bacher. And he was brilliant anyway, so he picked up languages. He picked up English incredibly quickly. He spoke German, he spoke Hungarian, he probably spoke Yiddish, though I don't know that for a fact, and he knew his alphabet, but he, like many Hungarian Jews and Jews from, German, Hungarian Jews, Austrian Jews, were interested in secularizing, and he was no different. And when he came, but his brother, he had a brother who did come to the States a few years later. His brother did maintain, was a mess, was a even bigger mess than Pulitzer was, brilliant as well, newspaperman as well, did maintain his Jewish faith to some degree, and Pulitzer did pay for him, even though his brother sadly committed suicide, did pay for a Jewish funeral. And even though Joseph was in Europe at the time, Joseph did not go to the funeral. There was a lot of animosity and difficulty between the brothers, but he did pay for a cantor to be there and for Jewish burial. However, Joseph himself, there's no. What we know is that he sent his children, his sons, to boarding schools where they were where they were taunted mercilessly for being Jewish, even though they knew very little about what being Jewish was. And I assume they were circumcised, though there's no record of that, no way of knowing. Um, uh, there were 7 children in all. 2 of them died. The boys were prepared to take over the newspaper business, and they did. And the one who was the least likely to succeed was sent to the St. Louis Dispatch and was by far the most successful. But there's no sign that they were raised, that there were bar mitzvahs, that there were, if there was, perhaps there was something in the home that was very discreet. They were not, and even though Pulitzer was in the press was called Joseph Pulitzer, there were Joseph Pulitzer. There were lots of nasty things said about him in the press of the day, and his enemy, arch enemy, William Randolph Hearst, was anti-Semitic. But Joseph seemed to take it all in stride, and he didn't seem to take any extra, he was interested in immigrants. He funded philanthropically immigrant issues. His wife was in charge of bread being given out weekly and other food to immigrants, and they funded a lot of other things. But the Columbia, which had a lot of already had Jewish funds, famously did not name the J School after Pulitzer until put his name on the building until many years later, when one of the deans at the 100th anniversary finally they honored Joseph in the way he should have been. But there's no clear sign. Joseph's children, some of them did marry Jews, and actually the most recent Pulitzer, who owned the Post-Dispatch until it was sold, his first wife passed away, and his second wife was Jewish. So there are a lot of Jews they married, but they themselves, they were all secularized Jews. He had only his one wife. He got married at a little, in his early, not in his early 20s. He waited a while, but he was only married once, and his wife outlived him by some 30 years. And there was a lot of animosity between the wife's family and his family. That's one could have made a whole nother film about that. You can look up the family lore, and there's a lot of it that's not in the film.
Yeah, I don't know if you can speak a little bit about it. Judy actually asked a question. She said, very little was said about Joseph's wife, despite an excellent and comprehensive documentary. What kind of relationship did they have?
She was a fascinating woman, and that's one of my regrets, is that in the structure we had, we didn't spend a little more time on her. She also, they both had these ailments, that something called neurasthenia in its day, and it was known as the disease of people who lived in the cities and people who were well-to-do. One could make a straight line from neurasthenia to neuroses to Freud to everything that follows. And the treatment for it was quiet. And so Pulitzer, aside from the fact that he went blind, he and his wife both had this condition where he in particular needed silence to a degree that was, except for music. He loved music, and I loved the fact that we were able to get a little quartet. He would have live music come and play for him, and he loved classical music, and and he had this room in his home where we filmed, where he had concerts, and but his wife was the long-suffering wife, truly, and there are stories we didn't include when one of his daughters was very ill and the wife was doting on this daughter. And Joseph said, "What about me? Why aren't you worrying about me?" Which she was. So he wasn't always, he did love her. And early on, it was truly a romance. She participated in a lot of charity activities. And there's some letters that we quote from. There's a diary and letters we quote from where she writes of her devotion to him and why it was often a one-way street, but she gave him every break in the book. And but he did go on these jaunts on his yacht on his own towards the end frequently with his, it was an all-male crew. He wasn't, there's no record of him that I know of him having lovers or anything like that. And remember, he loved to read, and he loved having his secretaries read to him. And he had a photographic memory, so they could read to him. And I'm sorry, I'm moving away from the wife, but they could read to him from his newspapers, because that's how he found out what was being written, and he could comment line for line on what he wanted changed the next time around, what stories he wanted to have followed. So his wife was able to get to him before he died. He had some sort of a heart attack, and his wife, he took these these pills, these treatments that helped him sleep. He couldn't sleep, and it's possible that some of these medications actually might have contributed to his death, but that's not clear either. His wife did make it to him before he passed away, and they are buried together in New York, in the Bronx. I can't tell you a lot more about her. She lived many years beyond that, and as I say, there was a lot of tension after his death between, over fortune and over the newspapers and over a lot of things. And I don't know what role she played in that. The women were famously left out of the newspaper business, which is a real shame. They were not brought up for it. And most of his he loved his daughters and he berated his sons. He never thought they were good enough. And he was always worried that wealth would corrupt them. And it did corrupt some of them, and others it did not.
This comes from Gail. She wants to know, how do you think Joseph's life reflects a Jewish lens?
Yeah, I think tremendously. I mean, I think when the question's asked, did he bring up his sons as Jews? I think there's many ways to bring one's children up as Jews. And so it's not simply bringing them up as observant, or I mean, I believe in that one's children should know Hebrew and should know the rituals, and one should have them in one's home. But there are plenty of Jews who don't go that way, and yet they are very much aware of themselves as Jews and having what was more of, perhaps in another day, a unified sense of what Jewish values were and how socially aware they were. And all of his papers, he brought up his kids to uphold, an interest in immigrants, an interest in social issues, an interest in the rights of those who have less, an interest in freedom of the speech, and for some freedom of speech, and for some people, perhaps the majority of Jews, those are strong Jewish values. he didn't seem to have that Jewish value of, there's no sign that he took special interest in the Jewish community. He broadened it to the immigrant community. So it's not, I can't say for sure, but we couldn't find more details about this. And I also want to say, we did not, when we were making this film, we were making this for a national public audience, not as a, even though I've made several films that are strongly Jewishly oriented films, and that was an interest of mine. It wasn't the predominant interest because it wasn't Joseph's predominant interest. So, but I think he fought on the side of the Union. He was for the abolition of slavery, but he also was into compromise. And he grew up in, he lived in his 20s in St. Louis, and St. Louis was famous border state, and he tried to make peace with all factions. And after the war, he didn't want people who were Confederates to be punished. And in fact, he married a niece of Jefferson Davis. So he had an open mind to Southerners and to Northerners, something we are still working on, to this very day. It's our struggle as Americans these days. It seems to be the struggle. I also, the newspaper in those days was like all newspapers, and I didn't emphasize this enough, and I wish I had, was the advertising was racist often. The portrayal of Black people, the portrayal of Asian people was racist. The articles in general were not, though many issues were ignored that would have been today not ignored. Jewish issues were mentioned, but not in any particularly, the pogroms were mentioned, but not in any big way. Issues having to deal with Asian or African Americans were relatively ignored, very minorly in the paper. So there were, it's not all, he was a great liberal Democrat, and he, he was way ahead of his time. Feminist issues, he hired Nellie Bly, he had other female journalists, but nobody in the administration of the paper was a woman. None, zero. There were lowly secretaries perhaps who were, but I'm not even sure about that, because in those days secretaries were often men, or predominantly men. But he did have some writers, and Nellie Bly he thought was fantastic, and he gave her some big breaks, and thank God he did.
Here's a question. Starting to get into the Pulitzer's paper, The World. Michael's asking, for a man who extolled accuracy in reporting, why did he encourage articles that were untrue before the Spanish War?
Yes, accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. He had signs up apparently all over the building, all over his offices. He wanted to make sure that his reporters would find the stories not by going, you got to go down to the Bowery. You can't just hear about the Bowery. You got to experience it yourself. And during the Spanish-American War, he succumbed. I believe he succumbed. And the question, this complicated issue, do you blame or credit the publisher of the paper with everything that's in the paper? Do you credit or blame? And yes, I think you do. The buck stops here, and it stops with the publisher. But in the Spanish-American War, his beloved daughter had died on New Year's Day a few months before the war, the jingoism about the war began. He was distraught and perhaps paying less attention to the paper. And one of his key regrets was that when William Randolph Hearst started getting ahead of the story with the explosion that was on the battleship, the Maine, and saying that it was certainly Spanish perfidy and that they had caused the explosion with absolutely no proof. Pulitzer's paper at first did not say that, but within a day or two, they succumbed as well to the call for war and attacking the Spanish. And as I say, it was one of his regrets, and he wrote a famous essay a few years later, speaking of that missed of that. And let's face it, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other papers of note have both extolled accuracy and have occasionally failed on that front and bought into what the administration or the government has said. And there have been famous cases. We don't need to go through them, but there's the ideal and there's the reality that the newspaper business is a business, just like all other businesses. And so when you're in a business, the business is to make money, and they made some crucial mistakes along the way. Somebody's saying, I'm just seeing here, according to Wikipedia, Pulitzer didn't reveal. That's not true. And if that's what Wikipedia says today, that's not correct. There were people who claimed that he said that his mother wasn't Jewish. My understanding, and again, there's like 5 biographies of Pulitzer, and they all say different things. But Jamie Morris, who's in the film and who we asked this question of many times, and I'm not saying, so you can't always trust Wikipedia because it's not always correct. But a lot of people keep going over it, and if you pick a hot button topic like Israel and the Palestinians, it can change 12 times a day. Didn't reveal his Jewish heritage. That's not my understanding. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you for sure.
So Jerry wants to know, besides The World and the Post-Dispatch, what were other publications that were under the Pulitzer umbrella? And was the name of his shul discovered in the research of Pulitzer?
There's a shul in his hometown in Hungary, but there's no sign that he ever. Nobody has told me or shown me anything that has shown that he ever walked into a shul in the United States. I'm not saying he didn't. Maybe he went every Yom Kippur, but there's no sign of it. There's no sign of I'm sorry that I can't. But what was the first part of that question besides the shul?
Other publications, under the Pulitzer.
Oh, well, he when he was alive, as far as I know, he only his brother had a newspaper. He had the two papers. When after he died, the family bought a lot of papers, a lot of smaller papers, a lot of mid-sized papers. They got into the television business. They had a fortune, and they had the brilliance to sell out right before the whole thing collapsed. So what they sold for, which is in the billions of dollars, a few years after they sold was only worth a fraction of what they sold for. And there was infighting, there were people, there was no heir. They didn't do it for the money. I mean, I don't know if they did it for the money or not, but they sold out when there was no heir that they felt could uphold, who was interested and wanted to uphold the tradition at the Post-Dispatch. And again, there was some family infighting. I don't know the justice of rival claims, because there were some people interested in carrying on the family business, but there was a decision made by the elders to just get out when the getting out was good. And that's what they did, for better or for worse, because many of these papers have been hollowed out by hedge fund. And I just want to put in a plug for all of you to contribute to your local papers. The New York Times, yeah, you can get a subscription. We all might have subscriptions to the Times, but the local papers that are really, really hurting, hurting the most, and they're important ones.
Here's another one from Jerry, wanting to know, do you know the value of Pulitzer's estate and also the donation, the estate at the time of his death, and also the donation to create the Pulitzer Prize?
Oh God, I believe that the prize was endowed, that the J School, and I hope I'm getting this right, and I'm sorry I didn't. I believe the J School at Columbia, which because of infighting, the school in Missouri, the J School in Missouri came first, but he had thought of it years before and had given the money to the J School, to Columbia, but they decided to wait till his death because there was too much conflict over what he wanted the J School to be and what they wanted the J School to be. I believe it was endowed at $1 million, and that the Pulitzer Prizes were also endowed at that amount. But that money sat there and grew from the time that money was given till the time it came into being. And the Pulitzer Prizes, when he first started, there were like 11 prizes or something. The number of prizes has grown considerably, and the independence of the Pulitzer Prizes. No Pulitzer family member is in any way involved, and they haven't been for many dozen years in selecting anything for them. So, but his estate was, he was, I don't want to pick the wrong number. He had several mansions. He had that enormous boat, and he was supporting a lot of causes, and so he was among the multi-millionaires of his generation.
And
His bill just for running the boat was astronomical.
And with those family members, this is from Maryland. She's asking who and where are some of his descendants now?
They're scattered far and wide. Many are still in the St. Louis area. There's some in New York. There's, as I said, there's been a division between the girls and the boys, and his wife's family and his family. Florida is one place where they are. There's some in Maine, California, upstate. I'm in the northwest corner of Connecticut, and one of the great grandchildren lives near here and is a supporter of many causes up in the Great Barrington area of Massachusetts. Michael Pulitzer Jr. or whatever. Yeah.
And this
he did not convert. There's a question. He certainly did not convert. And he was married in a Anglican church. And so he was not an opportunistic convert. He never did that. And I don't believe that any of his children, even though they might have, kind of practiced Christianity, there were, I don't know of any official converts, actually. And nor do I know of any who have moved back to being Jewish. So interesting legacy there.
And Patty's asking if accuracy was so important with his paper, why did he continue the war of yellow journalism?
Yellow journalism, just keep in mind that was for a short period during the Spanish-American War. And newspapers at the time, where there was a tradition of Western journalism, which I think it had the color red to it, and yellow journalism, and yellow was uh, introduced because of the cartoon. He was the first to introduce color to the newspaper with his cartoons, which were revolutionary. And I just want to point out all the revolutionary visual things he brought to the paper and all the popularizing things he brought to the paper. And I don't know if any of you have closely followed the New York Times since COVID. The Sunday Times has reintroduced family sections and things for kids to do, which he was famous for introducing to his paper. He was a real revolutionary in terms of imagining and figuring out how to bring new audiences and immigrant audiences to the paper. But in terms of yellow journalism, it was that one period, and it wasn't a very long period, where he did, because he was in this crazy competition with Hearst, which he later regretted, uh, fell down on the job, as did his editors, who may be more to blame, but the buck stops with Pulitzer.
Here's one from Harvey. Here it is. Can you please comment on the degree of influence and mutual bonding between Joseph Pulitzer and other renowned literary, journalistic, muckraking catalysts for socioeconomic change of the downtrodden working class, and exposure of the wealthy business barons such as Upton Sinclair, author of The Jungle, about the horrific working conditions of the meatpacking plants on Chicago's southwest side, the Joseph Armour plant in the back of the yards, and also its adverse environmental impact?
We're going to do a whole nother Zoom on just that one question, Harvey. That's.
I mean, they commented on the environment, like how he just Upton Sinclair described how the sewage was just running in there, and the Lithuanian immigrants would collapse on the job and die, and they just swept the body aside and put someone. I mean,
there is a whole. No, there is a whole section. Thank you. There's a whole section about the streets of New York, and immigrants living in these sewage, people dumping their waste out of buckets from their tenement buildings, and then the streets of New York, and the tons of manure, and the living conditions. Also, Nellie Bly famously writing in the paper about the horrific conditions of the mentally ill and people, who were not able to participate in society fully. He definitely wrote a lot. He had writers who were very focused on the awful working conditions of the immigrants, and improvements to that end. So he devoted a lot of space to these horrific immigrant rights issues, the shirtwaist fire, the people who worked in those awful conditions. So at the same time, he apparently, the one thing he did in league with Randolph Hearst was he fought against the Newsies' desire to get a few pennies more for delivering the newspaper. So even though he seems to have favored unions, when it came to his own business, he fought hard to break the Newsies. And that's at least one fact that in the famous film, The Newsies, is accurate. I can't speak to the accuracy of very much else in that film, but there is some truth to that aspect of it. And yes, he was very interested in muckraking, and one of his earliest things that he did when he was in St. Louis. He put stories in the paper which had never been seen before of how the wealthy avoided taxes and just, it was the honor system, and they wrote that they had zero, assets when they, and he put that list in the paper, and he's known to have hidden in a closet to be able to listen in to the goings on of the city council in St. Louis through the wall. We didn't get that story in the film, but there's a famous story of his listening through the wall to the story being told. So he used means that have been updated in our own times, but he truly, many of his, I make the point very early in the film that everything that's in the internet and everything that he anticipated the internet. They had 5, 6, 7 editions a day. Well, even the New York Times on the internet doesn't really keep up with that. He added visuals and cartoons and popularization, all the stuff that TV's been doing over the last 50, 60, 70 years. He was already doing all of that. So way ahead of his time.
All right, back to me. I get one again. You guys have awesome questions today. So in the film, Pulitzer described so many ways. You can say he's angry. You can say he's ambitious. I've also seen that people have called him a hero, just for what he did for probably the immigrants specifically. Do you consider him a hero in your mind?
I think he lived a heroic life for a reason that we haven't brought up, which is that the man was an immigrant, came to America, went blind, started losing his vision very early on, went blind years before he had this horrible condition called neurasthenia, where sounds were bothering him, and he kept at his work. He fought the good fight throughout that. And at a time when being blind was considered, you hid people away for being blind in those days. People who were blind were not, part of the society the way even today they're not completely, or people who are deaf are not. But there's been a movement towards integrating people in society. Well, here was this man who, yes, he had tremendous resources he could bring to bear, but he did in service of things he believed in, and he fought the fight against Teddy Roosevelt long past when he had to do that. So his heroism, I believe, there's small heroism and large heroism, and I don't know what's small or large, because I think any one of us who has illnesses or whatever, but who fights to get up in the morning and participate with our families, or do one thing a day that's meaningful, they're heroes to my mind. And he was fighting that fight every day. On top of that, he was championing immigrants to the end. And yeah, he had plenty of faults, and he was not shy about using his money for his own benefit. And he, is a complicated guy, and he was a very difficult guy. He'd made his workers and his family life quite impossible at times, but he's a complicated figure. And yeah, so I consider him more of a hero than anything else, which is why it was worth making a film about him.
All right, let's go back to the chat. My question time's over. We got two more questions, and we'll probably finish it up. Jerry would like to know, was Pulitzer an active contributor to his papers when he was publisher? Was his stance on social issues affected by the writings of Abraham Kahan of the Jewish Daily Forward?
Wow, I wish, and somebody has a question, I don't know what it was, at 2:30, can you comment on my 2:37 questions? And I can't go back that far, so either please ask it again or not. But did he play any instruments? That I do not know. I imagine a young man of his time and era, he was probably forced to play an instrument. As to whether he continued with that, I don't know. And ask me again, Justin, your question. Sorry, I apologize.
The Abraham Kahan one or instruments? I'm sorry.
Oh, Abraham Kahan. I really don't know the answer to that. That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that. Was there another question?
I just got one here
Yes.
from Ronald to asking, I guess, as he lost his eyesight, did he read through Braille?
No, he did not, and I don't know the history of Braille. He could afford these secretaries, and I think this book, Adventures with a Genius, is great. It's a beautifully written book about how how Pulitzer first interviewed him for the job and then demanded that he read every single newspaper they could get their hands on, and that he would prepare for Pulitzer every day along with the other secretaries on board. They would take shifts because Pulitzer was a famous insomniac. So there were some nights where his secretaries had to read to him straight through the night and take notes on everything that he said, because he would grill them on it the next day, and they would read through the newspapers, pick articles to read to him and have him comment on. But he didn't need to read Braille, I guess, because he had these literally round the clock secretaries who were there at his beck and call on board the boat and wherever else he was.
And lastly, we're years later from, Pulitzer's life, but how is this all still relevant here in 2021? Pulitzer.
I gotta say, Pulitzer used the term fake news in about 1903, and perhaps it was used before then by somebody else, but he spoke about freedom of speech. He spoke about accuracy in the media. He spoke about making sure, and I know he fell down on the job, but all these issues. And so I think, if for nothing else, I felt like you could pick up Pulitzer's paper from 100 years ago and felt like you were reading the New York Times in November of 2016 and 17 and 18. And he would have had a lot to say about the goings on in Washington and the role of the media. And he would have put up a good fight. Whether he would have won or lost, he certainly would have been accused of fake news by our last president. That's for sure. So very contemporary figure to my mind, and I feel like I learned a lot about not just the newspaper business and immigration and free speech and just about the visual display of his paper. And one thing we tried to do in the film, and I want to say, we tried to give the film that verve and that spirit of the paper, and we tried to make the sound effects extra lively to give one a sense of, I think, what Pulitzer would have done if he had been a filmmaker with the film medium. We at least tried to do that, and I hope we succeeded in some way.
Well, Oren, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for sticking with me for 9 months. Hope everyone enjoyed the film. Hope everyone enjoyed the Q&A today. Hope everyone enjoys the Oscars tonight if you want to watch the Oscars. And I see a couple more questions in here, and so what we'll do is maybe we'll close it now, but if you want to stick on and ask these questions, Michael and Harvey, just stay on and we'll do those. But really appreciate you all coming. Thanks again to our partner in congregations, the 6 congregations from 5 different states that have kind of been together to put this one together, which was Houston Congregation for Reform Judaism, Columbia Jewish Congregation, Congregation Torat El, East Brunswick Jewish Center, Ezra Havanim, the Niles Township Congregation, and Temple of Israel of Albany. So,
and I just want to say thank you very much. And Nomadland and Minari are my choices, my picks. And Pulitzer did hire some very Jack London other amazing writers for his papers along the way. A lot of the names you know and cartoonists he had them in his paper. So anyway, thank you. Great audience, great questions.
Yeah. And again, if you have some other additional few questions and you want to stick on, feel free to do so. And everyone have a good afternoon.
Great. Yeah, this is Mike. I have one quick question. The beginning of the movie starts off with talking about this newspaper that was found.
Yes.
And auctioned off. What happened to that newspaper?
Oh, Nicholson Baker. Yes, the paper is at Duke in their archives, and yeah, Nicholson Baker's one of the heroes of the film, who I should have said, because he's sort of responsible for saving the last long run of the world, and he offered it to, nobody wanted to buy it. He actually mortgaged his home to make sure that he could bid on the paper and get the rights to it, and then he gave it to Duke University that has it in their archives, and that's where we filmed. And holding that newspaper in your hands is one of my favorite experiences, because I started on page 1 and I wanted to read every article. They were all transfixing. They were fantastic.
How much was it auctioned off for? Do you know?
It was several $100,000. It was at the British Library, which one of the crimes of this century is that people believed in microfilm, and now that there's digitization, at least you can have a high quality copy. But there's nothing like holding a newspaper in your hand, and everything from the New York Public Library to the British. You'd think the British would hold on to their newspaper. They have held on to a lot, but they gave away a lot of it. They just it just disappeared into the ash heap of history. But Nicholson Baker is responsible for saving a lot of it.
Well, thank you for an excellent program.
Thank you. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm somebody has a raised hand. I don't know how to do this.
I got it. Oh, where'd you go? He was just there a second ago.
I wrote mine out. And you did an
okay.
job in terms of your mission, what you said you hope to accomplish, because having seen the film and heard the amazing. So given, I think when there was less high tech, people had a water. If they really had to work harder at, the honest report of it, it's selling the news, because they really had to put themselves into it. They couldn't just press a button and have special effects. They had to it.
Harvey, unfortunately, either on my end or on your end, that was a little
I'm sorry.
Hard to understand. There, you kept cutting out.
I'm sorry.
So I didn't quite get the gist of what you were saying.
You succeeded in your mission of what you hope to accomplish visually and audibly with the film, and creatively with the film. And I was just saying, in an earlier time, at that earlier time, pre-digital and all that, I mean, the reporters, the editors, they had to really, I'm assuming they were repeatedly, they had to really work hard at it. They couldn't, press a button and get a special Yellow Kids special effect. They had to really put themselves into it, like.
And and the artistry in the paper is, I mean, I think people are still putting themselves into it pretty, coming up with new ways.
They are.
Yeah, but that was a time where everything was done by hand and quite extraordinary. I agree. I'm with you. I'm going to have to run in a moment, but I just want to thank you all for staying on. I'm usually people drift off, so I really appreciate your constancy. Thank Thank you so
Well, I'm
much. And
sorry
thank
this
you.
seems obsessive, but you know if they ever met each other? Him and Upton Sinclair?
Oh, I think Sinclair might have written something for the paper, and I don't want to be quoted on that. But he wrote, there were
Right.
a lot of famous names in the paper, and it strikes me that Upton Sinclair might have, but I could be wrong. So I don't want to be, you come across famous names in there and you're like, oh, wow, look who wrote for the paper, you know? So, and they all needed to make a living anyway. They, you know, they needed to get paid.
That's right.
So, yeah.
Is there any
Well,
Oscar buzz for this documentary?
what's that?
Is there any Oscar buzz for your
Oh,
documentary?
we already, it was from a previous year. We're not up for it, but we did extremely well with this film, much better than I ever hoped. We showed in lots of festivals, film festivals in the US and around the world, and in Hong Kong, where probably these days it wouldn't happen, sadly. 2 years ago,
Not behind the red curtain.
2 years ago it did, and now it wouldn't. And in Jewish film festivals around the world and on television. So we've had a great run of it. And thank you, Justin, for putting this together. I'm glad we made it work. And I need to go. But
Thank you.
that's
No wonder
all.
you
You have
look so
other-
familiar.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Okay, take care.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much, both of you.